In the winter of 1990, a 31-year-old man named John O'Brien was working as a professional landscaper in a quiet, normal suburb just outside of the bustling city of Chicago, Illinois. John loved his job, and he spent his spring, summer, and autumn months working outdoors, transforming people's yards, planting beautiful gardens, and laying down fresh sod. But as anyone who has ever lived in Illinois knows, the winters in Chicago can be absolutely brutal. By the time January of 1990 rolled around, the ground was frozen solid, the wind was freezing, and the temperatures had dropped well below zero. Landscaping work had completely dried up for the season, and John was spending most of his days cooped up inside his house, trying to stay warm and dreaming of warmer weather. Eventually, John decided that he could not take the freezing cold anymore. He contacted his close friend David, who was also feeling completely exhausted by the long, dark, and bitterly cold Chicago winter. The two friends began talking about taking a vacation. They did not want to go just anywhere. They wanted to go somewhere incredibly warm, sunny, and beautiful. They wanted a true tropical escape where they could lay on a beach and completely forget about the snow and ice back home. After looking through various travel guides and flight options, the two men decided to book a trip to the beautiful Caribbean islands of Trinidad and Tobago. This was a twin island nation located in the southern Caribbean, known for its incredible weather, vibrant culture, and stunning sandy beaches. It seemed like the absolute perfect destination for their tropical getaway. They booked their flights and accommodation quickly, eager to leave as soon as possible. It is believed they boarded their plane and left Chicago on either January 8th or January 9th of 1990. When they landed in Trinidad, the contrast to Chicago was immediate and glorious. The air was warm, humid, and tropical. They stepped off the plane, walked through the airport, and made their way to their hotel. The hotel they had booked was located very close to the airport in Trinidad, which was incredibly convenient. They checked in, went up to their room, dropped their heavy winter luggage, and immediately changed into shorts and t-shirts. They were excited to start their vacation, so they headed straight out to explore the local town. Over the next several days, John and David had an amazing time. They walked through the streets of Trinidad, took in the sights, and sampled some of the delicious local Caribbean food. They decided they also wanted to see the sister island of Tobago, which was known for being even more laid-back and scenic. So, they took a relaxing 4-hour boat ride across the water to Tobago. They spent their days lounging on pristine beaches, swimming in the warm ocean water, and just relaxing. They felt incredibly lucky to be in paradise, while all of their friends and family back in Chicago were freezing in the sub-zero temperatures. By all accounts, their vacation was going exactly to plan. It was the perfect escape. But then, Sunday, the 14th of January, arrived. This was the day before they were scheduled to fly back home to Chicago. On this day, things began to take a very strange and highly concerning turn. John woke up that morning and began complaining of an unnamed health issue. To this day, the exact nature of this health issue has never been made public, so we do not know what symptoms he was experiencing. However, whatever this medical issue was, it was causing John a great deal of discomfort and distress. John decided that he needed to get a very specific medication to treat his condition. He left the hotel room and walked into the local town in Trinidad, searching for a drugstore. He found one, went inside, and asked the pharmacist for the specific medicine. But the pharmacist told him that they did not carry that medication. John did not want to give up, so he walked to another drugstore in a different part of town. But they did not have it either. He went to a third store and then a fourth, but none of the pharmacies in the town carried the medication he desperately felt he needed. With no success, John finally gave up and walked back to the hotel. When he walked into the room and saw David, David could immediately tell that something was seriously wrong with his friend. David would later state that John was not just upset about not being able to find the medication, he seemed to be in a highly distraught and erratic state. Even worse, John was becoming visibly disoriented. It seemed that whatever this unnamed health issue was, it was starting to severely affect his mental state. Because his condition was going untreated, it was manifesting in this highly confused, disoriented, and erratic behavior. David tried his best to calm John down and make him comfortable. He watched his friend closely, trying to decide if he needed to call a local doctor or take John to a hospital in Trinidad. But after a while, John seemed to quiet down a bit. David decided that John was stable enough to get through the night without emergency medical intervention. After all, they had a very early flight the next morning to return to Chicago. David reasoned that once they got back to the United States, John could easily see his own doctor and get the proper medication and treatment he needed. So, the two men decided it was best to just get some sleep. The hotel room was equipped with 2 twin-size beds, one for John and one for David. They turned off the lights, climbed into their respective beds, and quickly fell asleep. About an hour to an hour and a half after David had fallen asleep, he was suddenly and violently shocked awake. He could not breathe. In the pitch-black room, David realized that there was a man standing directly next to his bed, leaning over him. This man had his hands wrapped tightly around David's throat and was violently choking him with incredible force. David was completely terrified. He had no time to process what was happening or who was attacking him. He was in a state of pure panic, fighting for his life in the dark. Using his survival instincts, David began grabbing at the attacker's hands, trying to pry the fingers away from his windpipe. He fought with everything he had, and after a desperate struggle, he managed to gather enough strength to push the attacker's hands off of his neck. But the attacker was not finished. The man reached over to the nightstand, grabbed the heavy bedside lamp, and swung it down with immense force, smashing David directly in the head. The impact was incredibly painful, and the force of the blow knocked David completely out of his bed. He crashed heavily onto the hard floor. Before David could even recover or get to his knees, the attacker jumped down on top of him. The two men began fighting wildly on the floor in the darkness. David was struggling desperately, throwing punches and trying to get this violent intruder off of him. Finally, David managed to get a leverage advantage. He gathered all his strength and kicked the man off of him, sending him stumbling backward. David scrambled to his feet, gasping for air. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering into the room, he looked at his attacker and was completely paralyzed with shock. The person who had just tried to strangle him and beat him with a lamp was none other than his best friend, John. And John was completely naked. He was wearing absolutely no clothes. David stood there, bleeding and bruised, staring at his friend in utter disbelief. He asked John what on earth he was doing and what was wrong. But John did not answer. He did not say a single word. He did not even look like the same person. His eyes were wide and completely blank, and he seemed to be in the middle of a massive, terrifying, psychotic break. Instead of speaking, John suddenly turned around and bolted out of the hotel room. He ran out into the hallway, leaving the door wide open. He did not slow down. He ran down the long hallway, sprinted down the stairs, and burst into the hotel lobby. The hotel staff working at the front desk looked up in complete horror as a naked, wild-eyed man sprinted past them. John ran straight through the front doors of the hotel and vanished into the dark night. John ran down the street, his bare feet pounding against the hard pavement. He was in a state of pure frenzy, running as fast as he could. He ran for several minutes until he finally reached the perimeter of the nearby airport. The airport was heavily fortified with security fences. John did not go toward the main entrance gates. Instead, he ran to the side of the gates where there was a massive, towering chain-link fence. The very top of this fence was lined with thick, coiled barbed wire. Without stopping, John began to climb. Even though he was completely naked, he clawed his way up the metal chain-link fence. He reached the top and had to navigate the sharp, tearing barbs of the wire. He managed to drag his body over the top, likely suffering deep cuts and scratches, and dropped down onto the ground on the other side. But where John landed was not actually the open airport grounds. The airport had a double-fence security system. The two high fences ran parallel to one another, back to back, with a narrow strip of land in between them. This gap was a grassy, isolated no-man's land. It was specifically designed to act as a trap for anyone attempting to scale the outer fence. John was now trapped in this grassy strip. But he was on some kind of unstoppable manic mission. He did not try to climb back out to the street. Instead, he turned around and faced the second fence, the one that stood between him and the actual airport runway and buildings. Once again, John began to climb. He dragged his bare, bleeding body up the second high fence. He pulled himself over the barbed wire at the top and dropped down into the parking lot on the other side. He stood up and immediately began running toward the main airport terminal. But between him and the terminal building was another massive obstacle. It was a giant, towering concrete wall. This wall was smooth and solid with no handholds or footholds. It looked completely impossible to climb, especially for someone who was naked and injured. But John did not hesitate. He ran directly at the concrete wall, somehow managed to find a way to scramble up its smooth surface, and flipped himself over the top. On the other side of this wall was a secure area of the airport, and John landed directly next to a small wooden security guard shack. Inside this shack were 4 airport security guards who were on duty. They heard a loud thud, looked out their window, and were absolutely stunned to see a naked, bleeding man suddenly crash land right next to their building. The 4 security guards immediately opened their door and charged out of the shack to apprehend the intruder and find out what was going on. But as soon as they approached John, John turned on them and attacked. We do not know the exact details of the fight, but John was operating with a kind of manic, superhuman strength. Within moments, he managed to completely overpower all 4 of the trained security guards. Before the dazed guards could recover, John ran over to their 4-wheel drive security vehicle, which was parked right next to the shack. The keys were inside. John jumped into the driver's seat, started the engine, and slammed his foot on the gas. He roared away from the security shack, leaving the 4 injured guards in his dust. The guards got to their feet and started chasing him on foot, but they had no hope of catching up to the speeding vehicle. John drove wildly around the outside of the main airport building, navigating the secure service roads, and then he drove right out onto the active tarmac. Out on the tarmac, it was a busy night. There were several massive passenger airplanes moving slowly into position, preparing for takeoff. One of those planes was a giant British Airways jet airliner. This massive plane was actually the very next aircraft scheduled to take off. The pilots had already fired up the powerful jet engines, and the plane was sitting at the top of the runway, just waiting for final clearance from the air traffic control tower. John saw the massive airplane, and he steered the security vehicle directly toward it. He drove at high speed, crashing straight into the plane. However, the security vehicle he was driving was relatively small and low to the ground. It was not tall enough to strike the main fuselage or body of the massive British Airways jet. Instead, when John collided with the plane, the small 4-wheel drive vehicle slid right under one of the massive wings and became tightly wedged underneath it. By this time, the entire airport was in a state of high alert. The 4 security guards who had been attacked had radioed for help, and security personnel from all over the airport were streaming out onto the tarmac. They were running and driving toward the British Airways plane, where the wrecked security vehicle was wedged. As the guards and airport staff closed in on the scene, they witnessed something incredibly bizarre and disturbing. They looked through the window of the wrecked vehicle and saw John move from the driver's seat over to the passenger seat. He stood up through the open side of the vehicle. The guards could see that he had a very deep, nasty cut on his shoulder, which was bleeding heavily. John reached up with his hand and touched the underside of the airplane's wing. The wing had been damaged in the crash, and thick black engine oil was leaking out of it, dripping down onto the vehicle. John rubbed his hand in the leaking oil, coating his fingers in the thick black fluid. Then he took his oil-covered fingers and began dabbing and packing the oil directly into the deep, open wound on his shoulder. Before the security guards could reach him, John leaped out of the wrecked vehicle. He hit the ground running, darting away from the approaching guards and disappearing into the shadow of the massive airplane. In the utter chaos of the moment, with sirens blaring, engines roaring, and dozens of people running around the tarmac, the security guards momentarily lost sight of him. He had vanished behind the giant aircraft. The security guards and airport personnel came to a stop about 100 feet away from the plane and the wedged vehicle. They stood there in a defensive line, trying to scan the dark tarmac, completely bewildered by what they were witnessing. They were on their radios calling for local police and medical backup, trying to figure out how to handle this naked, seemingly unstoppable man. Then, suddenly, one of the officers spotted movement about 300 feet away. On the other side of the plane, near one of the airport buildings, John emerged from the shadows. He began sprinting back toward the airplane. He was running directly toward the wall of security guards and airport staff. John was incredibly fast. Before anyone could react or move forward to tackle and apprehend him, he reached the side of the plane. He stopped for a split second. He did not look at the guards. Instead, he looked up at the massive spinning jet engine of the British Airways plane. The engine was turned on, and its giant blades were rotating at an incredibly high speed, creating a massive vacuum of suction. John took a breath, and then he leaped directly into the spinning engine. In an instant, John ceased to exist. The sheer force of the jet engine completely decimated him. It was a horrific and instantaneous end to a bizarre and tragic sequence of events. To this day, no one knows for sure what actually caused John O'Brien's sudden violent rampage. It is widely assumed by investigators and medical professionals that he suffered a severe, acute psychotic episode brought on by whatever unnamed health issue he was experiencing, combined with the stress of not being able to find his medication. Ultimately, his tragic death was officially ruled as a suicide. Now, our second story takes us to the world of extreme sports, and to a place that was built for the world's greatest athletes, but became the site of a tragic and unthinkable disaster. Luge is widely considered to be one of the most dangerous and intense sports in the Winter Olympic Games. The premise of the sport is relatively simple, but incredibly terrifying when you really think about it. One or two athletes, who are known as lugers, lie flat on their backs on a small, heavy sled. They then slide down a steeply pitched, winding track made of solid ice. These ice tracks are highly engineered with steep, banked curves and narrow straights. As the lugers slide down, they have very little control. They steer using subtle movements of their calves and shoulders. The speeds they reach are absolutely mind-blowing. A professional luger can easily reach speeds of 80 miles per hour and sometimes even faster. If anything goes wrong, if they lose control for even a fraction of a second, the resulting crash can be catastrophic, often leading to severe injuries or death. In the year 1986, a state-of-the-art luge track was constructed on a ski hill in Alberta, Canada. This track was built specifically to host the bobsled and luge events for the upcoming 1988 Winter Olympic Games, which were held in Calgary. The entire facility, which included the ski hill, the ski jumps, and the sliding track, was named Canada Olympic Park. After the 1988 Winter Olympics concluded, the park remained open. The local government and athletic associations decided to keep the facilities active so that the public could enjoy them for recreational purposes and so that future athletes would have a place to train. Nearly 30 years later, on the night of the 29th of January 2016, three teenage boys decided they wanted to find some late-night adventure. They drove over to Canada Olympic Park long after the facility had closed for the night. The park was dark and quiet, and there was nobody around. The three boys made their way up the snowy hill, carrying cheap, simple plastic sleds that they had brought with them. They hiked up the slope until they reached a highly restricted area. Standing in front of them was a prominent 6-foot-tall blue chain-link fence. This fence was covered with large, bright warning signs. The signs explicitly told the public to stay back and warned that entering the area was strictly forbidden unless you were authorized personnel. None of these three teenage boys were authorized personnel. However, one of the boys had actually worked at Canada Olympic Park the previous winter. His job had been selling tickets to visitors, so he was very familiar with the layout of the park and knew exactly where the luge track started. The boys stood at the fence and looked past it. Inside the perimeter of the blue fence, they saw a tall flight of stairs. These stairs led up to a wooden structure that looked almost like a cozy log cabin. This building was the starting house for the Olympic luge track. The ice track itself literally began inside this starting house and then fed out through a large opening, winding its way down the steep mountain below. The three boys looked at each other and grinned. They thought it would be incredibly fun and thrilling to ride their plastic sleds down an actual Olympic luge track. So they tossed their plastic sleds over the 6-foot blue fence. Then, one by one, they climbed up and over the fence, ignoring the warning signs. Once they were on the restricted side, they picked up their plastic sleds and walked up the wooden stairs, entering the quiet starting house. Inside, it was cold and dark. They started talking about who would go down first, second, and third. They had actually brought helmets with them, so they buckled them on. They also strapped on headlamps, which allowed them to see the track ahead of them because the powerful lights that normally illuminated the track at night were turned off. One by one, the boys positioned themselves on their plastic sleds and pushed off down the icy track. But as they started sliding, they quickly realized that this was not the high-speed thrill ride they had anticipated. In fact, they were going surprisingly slow. The luge track was designed for professional sleds, which have highly polished steel runners or blades on the bottom. Those blades glide effortlessly over the ice, building massive speed, but these boys were on cheap, flat plastic sleds. The plastic created a lot of friction against the cold ice, and as a result, the boys kept slowing down. In fact, they had to constantly use their feet and hands to push themselves along just to keep moving down the track. Eventually, after a slow, frustrating, and painful journey, all three boys made it to the bottom of the track. They were pretty disappointed. They had expected an adrenaline-fueled rush, but instead they had barely crawled down. But then, they had an idea. They realized that the reason they went so slow was because they did not have enough weight on the light plastic sleds. They figured that if they all got onto one single plastic sled together, their combined weight would create enough momentum to overcome the friction of the ice, and they would go much faster. So, they picked up one of the sleds and marched all the way back up the hill. They climbed the stairs and entered the starting house once again. All three of them squeezed on to the single plastic sled, wrapping their arms and legs around each other. With a heavy push, they launched themselves down the track. And this time, it worked. The added weight of the three boys made a massive difference. They flew down the icy track, picking up incredible speed. They zoomed around the banked curves, feeling the cold wind rushing past their faces. It was an absolute blast. It was exactly the high-speed rush they had been looking for. They enjoyed it so much that they decided to do it a few more times. They hiked back up, loaded up, and slid down again. But after a few runs, they realized they were pushing their luck. They did not want to get caught by security. So they decided to call it a night. They climbed back over the blue fence, got into their car, and snuck out of the park completely undetected. The experience had been so exhilarating that they could not stop talking about it all week. They decided that they had to do it again the following weekend. But this time, they wanted to share the experience with their friends. They recruited 5 more teenage boys, telling them all about how amazing it was to fly down an actual Olympic track at night. On the night of Friday, the 5th of February 2016, which crossed over into the early morning hours of Saturday, February 6th, the group of 8 teenage boys drove to Canada Olympic Park. The 3 boys who had been there the previous weekend led the way. They walked up the dark ski hill, guiding their 5 friends through the snow. They reached the same 6-foot blue fence surrounding the luge starting house. One by one, all 8 boys scaled the blue fence and gathered on the other side. They walked up the stairs and piled into the cold starting house. They had brought 3 plastic sleds with them this time. They began discussing how they should divide themselves up to get the maximum amount of speed. They decided to put 3 boys on the first sled, 3 boys on the second sled, and the remaining 2 boys on the third and final sled. Because the previous weekend's runs had gone so smoothly, the boys had become incredibly overconfident. The 3 original boys told the others that the run was completely safe and that they did not need to worry. As a result, the group decided they did not need to wear helmets. They left their helmets behind. Not only that, but they also decided not to bring any headlamps or flashlights. They thought it would be much more exciting and terrifying to go flying down the winding icy track in complete pitch black darkness. Shortly after midnight on February 6th, the first group of 3 boys climbed onto the first plastic sled. They positioned themselves tightly, holding on to one another, and pushed off into the dark. At first, everything went exactly to plan. They started picking up speed, sliding smoothly down the first few turns of the track. They were laughing and shouting, feeling the thrill of the icy air. They were going very fast. But what none of these boys knew was that during the week, park staff had put up a safety barrier. Specifically, they had strung a heavy metal chain directly across one of the lower sections of the track. This chain was used to secure a large wooden barrier that kept a specific alternate section of the track in place when it was not in use. As the first sled came flying around a sharp, dark corner at a high rate of speed, the 3 boys had absolutely no warning. In the pitch blackness, they could not see the heavy metal chain stretched across the track. The chain was positioned at approximately neck height for anyone sitting on a sled. The first sled struck the metal chain at full speed. The impact was catastrophic. The chain instantly decapitated and killed the boy sitting at the very front of the sled. He was 17-year-old Evan Caldwell. He died on impact. The other 2 boys on the sled were violently thrown from the vehicle, crashing hard into the icy concrete walls of the track. Both of them were knocked completely unconscious, suffering severe injuries. Back up at the top of the track, inside the starting house, the remaining 5 boys were waiting. They had no idea that a tragedy had just occurred. They could not see down the dark track, and they could not hear anything. The boys on the first sled were either dead or unconscious, so there were no screams or calls for help reaching the top of the hill. The second group of 3 boys waited for what they estimated was a safe amount of time. They wanted to make sure the first sled had reached the bottom and cleared the track. Once they figured enough time had passed, the 3 boys piled onto the second sled and pushed off into the darkness. They went hurtling down the track, picking up speed just like the first group. But as they rounded that same sharp corner near the bottom, they also struck the heavy metal chain. However, by some absolute miracle, the second group of boys hit the chain in a slightly different way. The angle of their sled or the way they were leaning caused them to slip just under the chain as they hit it. but the impact still violently threw all three of them off their sled. They were launched into the air and slammed hard onto the icy track. The boys on the second sled survived, though they were badly battered. The worst injury among them was a badly broken ankle. They scrambled to their feet, completely disoriented and terrified. It was pitch black, and they had no idea what they had just crashed into. They were trying to gather their thoughts and find their friends from the first sled. But before they could figure out what was happening, and before they had a chance to yell up the track to warn the final group, it was already too late. The third and final group, consisting of the last two boys, had already pushed off from the starting house. The boys on the track heard the faint, terrifying sound of a plastic sled whistling down the ice toward them. All they could do was scramble to the side of the track to avoid being hit as the third sled came bombing down the hill at full speed. The final two boys on the third sled rounded the corner in the dark and struck the metal chain at maximum speed. One of the boys on this final sled was 17-year-old Jordan Caldwell. Tragically, Jordan was also struck at neck height by the heavy chain. He was killed instantly. Jordan was the twin brother of Evan Caldwell, the boy on the first sled, who had died just minutes earlier. The other boy on the third sled was thrown violently from the wreckage, suffering incredibly severe, life-threatening injuries. One of the survivors of the initial crash was a boy named Caleb. Case had been on the first sled and had been knocked unconscious when he was thrown. When Caleb finally started to regain consciousness, he found himself lying in a section of the track that was covered by a large protective tarp. At first, Caleb could not see anything and he could not hear anything. He felt completely numb. But he immediately realized that he was struggling to breathe. He felt like there was something physically lodged in his throat, blocking his airway. In reality, his throat had been severely crushed and damaged when he collided with the metal chain. As he lay there gasping for air, his senses slowly began to return. His vision cleared slightly, and he looked up. He saw one of the boys from the second sled kneeling right beside him on the ice. This boy had not been severely injured, and he had placed his hand gently on Caleb's shoulder. He was loudly praying, begging God to let Caleb survive. As Caleb lay there listening to the prayer, his hearing began to improve, and he started to hear another sound nearby. It was the voice of a boy named Mark, who had been on the first sled. Mark was very badly injured, and his face was severely fractured and bleeding. But despite his immense pain, Mark was lying on the ice, softly singing a religious song. He was trying to keep everyone's spirits up, trying to encourage the survivors to hold on and keep fighting to stay alive until help arrived. Then, Caleb heard the faint sound of someone speaking to an emergency dispatcher on a cell phone, calling 911. Shortly after that, Caleb blacked out again. When the paramedics and emergency rescue crews finally arrived at Canada Olympic Park, they made their way up to the restricted track. They found a scene of absolute devastation. The 8 boys were scattered all over the lower section of the ice track, having been thrown in different directions by the violent impacts. But when the paramedics located the bodies of the 2 boys who had died, they discovered something deeply moving. The twin brothers, Evan and Jordan Caldwell, were lying right next to each other on the ice. Even though they had gone down the track in different sleds at different times, they ended up side by side in their final moments. None of the surviving boys had moved them, they had simply landed near one another. For the Caldwell family, the loss of both of their twin sons in a single night was an unfathomable tragedy. The grief was devastating for the entire community. But there was a small, haunting solace in knowing that the twins were together at the very end. The 6 surviving boys eventually recovered from their physical wounds, but they walked away with life-altering brain injuries, physical scars, and a deep, permanent sense of guilt and regret. They knew they were incredibly lucky to be alive, but they would have to carry the memory of that terrible night for the rest of their lives. Our third and final story explores the concept of intelligence and how even the most brilliant minds can make decisions that lead to their own undoing. IQ, which stands for intelligence quotient, is a scientific measure of a person's cognitive abilities and intelligence. To find your IQ score, you have to take a highly specialized, standardized test administered by psychologists. The vast majority of the human population, about 68%, will score right around 100 on an IQ test. This is considered to be the average range of human intelligence. A much smaller group of people, who are considered highly gifted, will score somewhere between 130 and 160. And then there is an incredibly tiny fraction of the population that scores above 160. These people belong to the true genius class. To put this into perspective, Albert Einstein, who is widely regarded as one of the most brilliant theoretical physicists in human history, is believed to have had an IQ of around 160. He was right on the cusp of this genius class. But as we will see in this final story, having a genius-level intellect does not protect a person from making an incredibly poor lapse in judgment. In the year 1991, 31-year-old Jackie Kotarek was a woman who seemed to have everything going for her. Jackie was an absolute genius. She had been tested and was found to have an IQ of 170. That meant she was statistically smarter than Albert Einstein. Jackie used her incredible brain to pursue a career in medicine. She graduated with top honors from the prestigious medical school at the University of California, Los Angeles, also known as UCLA. After graduating, she completed her medical residency, which is a rigorous multi-year training program for new doctors, at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. Cedars-Sinai is widely known as one of the best and most advanced hospitals in the United States. Once she finished her residency, Jackie decided to move slightly north of Los Angeles to the city of Bakersfield, California. There, she opened her very own private medical practice. She quickly built a highly successful business, and she was widely respected by her peers. In addition to running her busy practice, she also became a part-time professor at her alma mater, UCLA, commuting back to Los Angeles to teach the next generation of doctors. By all accounts, Jackie was brilliant, wealthy, and deeply passionate about her work. Her patients absolutely adored her because of her kind demeanor and medical expertise, and her students at UCLA highly respected her lectures. Fast forward 19 years to the year 2010. Jackie was now 49 years old. She was still running her successful medical practice in Bakersfield, still teaching at UCLA, and was highly active in her community. However, her personal life was somewhat complicated. She was in an on-again, off-again romantic relationship with a 58-year-old man named William Moody. While the intimate details of their relationship were kept private, it was clear from local news reports and police statements that Jackie and William had a very volatile relationship. They fought frequently, often breaking up and then getting back together. On the evening of Wednesday, the 25th of August 2010, Jackie went out by herself to a local Mediterranean restaurant in Bakersfield. She sat at the bar and began having some drinks. She stayed at the restaurant for a while, and as the night went on, she became visibly intoxicated. At some point during the night, realizing she had had too much to drink, Jackie used her phone to call a local ride-sharing or taxi service to pick her up and take her home. It seemed like a responsible decision, as she knew she was too drunk to drive her own car. The following morning, Thursday, August 26th, Jackie's medical assistant arrived at the practice in Bakersfield. She opened up the office and waited for Jackie to arrive. But the start of the workday came and went, and Jackie did not show up. This was incredibly unusual for Jackie. She was extremely professional and punctual, and she never missed appointments with her patients without giving advance notice. The assistant became worried and dialed Jackie's cell phone. But the call went straight to voicemail. The assistant waited a bit and tried calling again, but there was still no answer. Feeling that something was wrong, the assistant decided to call Jackie's boyfriend, William Moody. William answered his phone. The assistant asked him if he had seen Jackie, explaining that she had not showed up for work and was not answering her phone. William told the assistant that he had actually seen Jackie the night before. William went on to explain his version of events. He said that on Wednesday night, he was home alone at his house in Bakersfield, which was located not very far from the Mediterranean restaurant where Jackie had been drinking. William said that late that night, he looked out his window and saw Jackie's car pull up and park directly in front of his house. He said he could tell from her body language and the way she was walking that she was highly upset about something. William said he got the strong feeling that she was coming over to start a massive fight with him. William decided that he did not want to deal with a confrontation. So, instead of going to the front door to talk to her, he quietly slipped out the back door of his house. He ran off his property through the back gate, completely avoiding her. William said he walked a few blocks over to a friend's house who lived nearby. He asked his friend if he could spend the night, and his friend agreed. When the medical assistant called William on Thursday morning, William was actually still at his friend's house. He had not yet returned to his own home. He told the assistant that he assumed Jackie had eventually realized he wasn't home and had driven away. However, William told the assistant that he would head back to his house right away to see if Jackie was still there or if there was some indication of where she might have gone. William hung up the phone, left his friend's house, and walked the couple of blocks back to his property. When he turned the corner onto a street, he immediately saw Jackie's car parked right where it had been the night before, sitting directly in front of his house. William knew that his house was completely locked and that Jackie did not have a key. He figured she must be asleep inside the car, waiting for him to return. William walked up to the car, preparing himself for an argument. But when he looked through the glass window, he saw that the car was completely empty. However, when he looked closer, he saw that Jackie's purse, her wallet, and her cell phone were all lying on the passenger seat. This made no sense. Why would she leave all of her personal belongings in an unlocked car and walk away? William turned and looked at his house. He wondered if she had somehow managed to get inside or if she was waiting for him in the backyard. He began walking around the perimeter of his house, calling out Jackie's name. There was no response. When he reached the backyard, he did not see Jackie, but he noticed something strange lying on the ground near his back door. It was a heavy metal shovel. William walked over and looked at his back door. He noticed fresh scrape marks and damage around the door frame and lock. It looked very obvious that someone, presumably Jackie, had tried to use the shovel to pry the back door open to break into the house. But the lock had held, and the attempt had failed. William continued walking around the rest of his property calling out for her, but the yard was completely empty. He decided she must have found another way into the house. He walked to the front door, inserted his key, and unlocked it. He stepped inside, feeling highly anxious, expecting to find Jackie sleeping on his couch or waiting for him. He searched every room, every closet, and the basement. All the windows were tightly locked from the inside, and all the doors were secure. There was absolutely no sign of Jackie and no indication that anyone had been inside the house since he had left the night before. William was completely baffled. Her car was out front, her purse and phone were inside the car, and there was a shovel near the damaged back door, but she was nowhere to be found. He called the medical assistant back and told her what he had found. He suggested that maybe Jackie had gotten frustrated, left her things in the car, and called another ride to go somewhere else. He said he was sure she would turn up soon. But the assistant felt a deep sense of dread. She told William that this was completely unlike Jackie and that they needed to contact the police immediately. William agreed, and they called the Bakersfield Police Department to report Jackie missing. The police began their investigation by going to Jackie's own home, but they found no sign of her. Her neighbors had not seen her. Then the officers went to William's house. They searched Jackie's car, documenting the purse and phone. They looked around the exterior of William's house, noting the shovel and the damaged back door. They also did a brief search of the inside of William's home, but they found nothing unusual. The police interviewed neighbors, friends, and family members, but no one had any information. They told William and the assistant that without any evidence of foul play, they simply had to wait. They suggested that Jackie might just be hiding out somewhere because she was upset and that she would likely return on her own. 2 days passed, and there was still no sign of Jackie. On Friday, William left the country on a pre-planned, pre-arranged vacation. Because the police had found no evidence of foul play and did not consider William a suspect, he was cleared to travel. Before he left, William asked one of his close friends to go over to his house during the weekend to feed his pet fish. On Saturday morning, 48 hours after Jackie had been reported missing, William's friend drove over to the house. He unlocked the front door and stepped inside. As soon as he opened the door, he was hit by a horrific, overwhelming odor. It was the unmistakable smell of something decaying. The friend covered his nose and mouth with his shirt, gagging. He began walking through the house, trying to find the source of the terrible smell. He first checked the kitchen, thinking that perhaps some meat had gone bad in the refrigerator or that the trash had been left full, but the kitchen was clean. He checked the pet fish tank, but it was fine. He followed the scent as it grew stronger, leading him into the living room. He realized the smell was strongest near the fireplace. The friend walked over to the fireplace. He knelt down and looked inside the hearth where the logs were placed, but there was nothing there. He tilted his head and looked directly up into the dark chimney flue. About 2 feet up the narrow flue, dangling down in the darkness, were 2 human legs. The friend gasped in horror, ran out of the house, and immediately called the police. When investigators and forensic teams arrived, they confirmed that the body stuck inside the chimney was indeed the missing doctor, Jackie Kotarek. Through a careful reconstruction of the evidence, investigators were able to piece together exactly what had happened on that fateful Wednesday night. After leaving the Mediterranean restaurant, Jackie had decided to drive her car to William's house instead of taking the ride service she had called. When she arrived, William had already slipped out the back. Jackie knocked on the doors and windows, but got no response. Being highly intoxicated and upset, she became determined to get inside. She found a shovel in the yard and tried to pry open the back door, but she was unsuccessful. Then she noticed a permanent ladder or structure attached to the back of the house. Despite being intoxicated, Jackie climbed up the ladder and got onto the roof. She walked over to the brick chimney. There was a protective metal cap over the top of the chimney to keep rain and animals out. Jackie managed to pry this cap off. She then decided to lower herself feet first down into the dark, narrow chimney flue, believing she could slide down into the fireplace and enter the house. But she did not realize how narrow the chimney actually was. The flue was not a uniform shape. It started wider at the top and became much narrower as it descended. At some point during her descent, Jackie became completely and tightly wedged in the brick structure. Her arms were likely pinned above her head or tight against her sides, rendering them completely useless. There was nothing for her hands to grab onto, and there was no ledge for her feet to push against. She was completely trapped in the dark, vertical stone shaft. Because William was not home, her screams for help went completely unheard. And then, a terrifying medical phenomenon occurred. It is known as mechanical or positional asphyxia. Every time Jackie took a deep breath and exhaled to scream, her chest would naturally contract and become slightly smaller. Because of gravity, she would slide a fraction of an inch deeper into the narrowing chimney. When she tried to take her next breath, she found that her chest could not expand back to its original size because the tight brick walls of the chimney acted like a rigid, constricting vice. With every breath she took, she slipped lower and the walls became tighter. Her lung capacity shrank second by second, minute by minute. Eventually, she no longer had the lung capacity or the strength to make a loud sound. She could only utter faint, desperate whispers. We know she was alive for a long time. In fact, on Thursday night, William was inside the house sleeping, completely unaware that his girlfriend was trapped just feet away in the chimney. And on Friday night, nearly 48 hours after she had first entered the chimney, neighbors reported hearing a faint, distant voice crying out for help. But they assumed it was just children playing in a nearby pool, so they did not investigate. Shortly after that, Jackie succumbed to the pressure on her chest and passed away. It took local firefighters over 5 hours of carefully chipping away at the heavy brick chimney to finally recover her body. The medical examiner officially ruled her death an accident caused by positional asphyxia. No charges were ever filed, as it was clear that this was a tragic, self-inflicted accident. It was a devastating end for a woman who possessed a genius-level intellect but made one single fatal error in judgment on a dark California night. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. The beginning of our story takes place on Chichijima, a small and rough bit of land located in the Pacific Ocean. Situated around 500 miles south of the main Japanese archipelago, this island belongs to the Japanese nation. This island, which appeared to be in a remote location, became of tremendous significance during the Second World War. On that island, the Japanese military had established a military installation, and at the very pinnacle of the island's two mountains, they had constructed two formidable radio towers. In the Pacific theater of the war, these towers were more than simply regular structures. They served as the eyes and ears of the Japanese military. In addition to being essential for communication and surveillance, they enabled the Allies to monitor the movements of their own soldiers and coordinate their own operations. This resulted in Chichijima being completely turned into a fortified location. As many as 25,000 soldiers were stationed on the island when it reached its peak population. It was armed with enormous anti-aircraft weapons, all of which were aimed at the sky and were already waiting. A hornet's nest was the island in question. Chichijima and the radio towers that it contained posed a significant challenge for the United States military. They posed a persistent danger, concealed a weakness in their operations, and provided Japan with a distinct advantage from a strategic standpoint. At this point, the Americans were aware that they needed to remove the island from the equation. The first thing that came to their minds was an all-out invasion. Those responsible for planning and strategy gathered around maps in an effort to determine the most effective method of deploying troops on the beaches. On the other hand, the work appeared to be more difficult the more people looked at it. To put it in the greatest possible terms, military strategists had a strong recommendation against it. The argument that they put out was that any amphibious landing on an island that was so well guarded would be a massacre. They anticipated that the American forces would suffer an intolerable number of losses, and even if they were correct, there was no assurance that they would be successful. It seems highly possible that the Japanese would be able to repel the invasion by digging in and battling to the very end. Not a single concept was pursued. The United States of America then moved on to the next best thing. In the event that they were unable to seize the island, they would blind it. According to the new plan, the two radio towers were going to be destroyed from the air. If the communications and monitoring systems on the island were rendered ineffective, the island would lose its strategic value. Therefore, in the month of June in the year 1944, a group of American aircraft carriers, which are essentially enormous floating airfields, made their way towards Chichijima. They formed a steel ring on the ocean, encircling the island in a continuous manner. Pilots from the United States of America started their missions on the decks of these carriers. With the intention of destroying those towers, they continued to launch their aircraft on a daily basis, flying straight into the heart of the island's defenses. However, the Japanese struck back with such vigor that it left the Americans in a state of shock. Suddenly, the sky over Chichijima was filled with anti-aircraft fire, creating a storm. There was a widespread explosion of flak, which was black in color and tore through the air, as well as the fuselages of American aircraft. Attackers were surrounded by a swarm of Japanese fighter planes. It was complete and utter chaos. On a constant basis, the American air raids were unsuccessful, despite the bravery and dedication of the American men. Although they suffered tremendous fatalities, including the loss of planes and pilots, the towers were able to remain standing. After a number of months of these gruesome and unsuccessful missions, the leadership of the American military was becoming increasingly frustrated. Despite the fact that they were aware that it would be a challenging task, they did not anticipate the level of resistance that they encountered. The island had a reputation for being extremely dangerous. In spite of this, the strategic significance of the situation was so high that they could not simply give up. The directives were crystal clear: continue to dispatch pilots until the task is completed. From this point forward, we are now in September of 1944. Once more, the Americans were making preparations for a significant assault on the island of Chichijima. There was a young pilot who was getting ready for the mission while he was aboard one of the aircraft carriers. His name was George, and he was the youngest pilot in the whole United States Navy. He was only 20 years old at the time. The truth was that his age was a lie. George was already a veteran of the military force. Not only had he completed a number of perilous missions, but he had also been shot down in the past. During a previous flight, his plane had been struck, and he had been compelled to eject over the wide ocean. It was a horrific encounter that ultimately resulted in him being rescued from the water. One of the most important and life-saving lessons he had learned from that encounter was one that he would keep in mind in the days and weeks to come. George, along with his two-man crew, made their way across the flight deck on the morning of the raid. There was a man named Dell, who was his radio operator, and Ted, who was his door gunner, were present. As a result of their previous experience flying together, the three of them formed a close-knit team. He was aware of the dangers. They had prior knowledge of the island's reputation, which they were about to target. They boarded their aircraft, which was a Grumman TBM Avenger, a capable torpedo bomber that was not only strong, but also a formidable adversary. Despite the stress that permeated the atmosphere, they went through their pre-flight checks, the regularity that they were accustomed to providing a measure of solace. When the order was received, it was 7:15 in the morning. George and his crew, along with scores of other American aircraft that were participating in the operation, roared to life and took off from the deck of the ship. Almost immediately, George started climbing, and he continued to push his plane higher and higher into the sky. His objective was to reach a height that was greater than 8,000 feet. This was the magic number, the altitude that was widely regarded to be outside the effective range of the Japanese anti-aircraft weapons that were located on the island below. The strategy for the expedition was simple, but it was packed with extremely hazardous elements. When flying over the island at this safe altitude, each and every plane in the formation would fly over it. After that, in order to drop their bombs with precision, they would have to perform a maneuver known as a submerged bomb. In order to get back out of range, they had to draw up and climb as quickly as they could. This meant that they had to lower the nose of their jet, dive steeply towards the target, and get deep below the 8,000-foot safety line. After that, they had to release their bombs. They were put in danger for a few crucial moments as a result of a maneuver that exposed them to intensive enemy fire. George had run missions similar to this one in the past. He had a lot of expertise, and he didn't show any hesitation. The attack dive was initiated by him, making him one of the first pilots in the formation to do so. The landscape below him erupted into chaos as soon as his plane descended below 8,000 feet for the first time. Suddenly, the island was engulfed in flames. They felt as though angry fingers were reaching out towards them from the anti-aircraft weapons, which were tracers. The sky was characterized by the dark clouds that were caused by flak blasts. This was a relentless onslaught of noise and violence, and it was so loud that it was deafening. While George concentrated, he kept his gaze fixed on the radio tower that he had been tasked with destroying. It was almost instantaneous when he experienced a series of intense shudders. A flash appeared on the side of his jet, and he spotted it. It was a blow to them. His controls were examined by him. Even though the plane had sustained damage, it continued to fly. There was a sense of stability. When that split second passed, he was faced with a decision. Either he could cancel the run and attempt to save the jet, or he could click the attack button and finish the mission. The decision to finish the assignment was his own. Over the speaker, he called back to his crew, instructing Del and Ted to hang on to their seats as tightly as they could. At the same time, as he ignored the damage and the unrelenting fire coming from below, he maintained the plane in its steep descent. They proceeded downward, passing through 7,000 feet, 6,000, and 5,000 times. This caused the ground to rush up to meet them. George let go of his burden when he was 3,000 feet in the air, with the radio tower becoming the focus of his attention. 2 bombs, weighing 500 pounds each, were torn away from the aircraft. He observed them for a brief period of time and realized that they had successful. To hit directly, a cloud of smoke and debris rose from the skyscraper as it was being demolished. On the other hand, their accomplishment came at a very expensive cost. The situation with George's plane was extremely precarious at this point. There was a fire that had been started earlier by the hit that he had suffered, and now the aircraft was becoming completely consumed by flames. Smoke was rising into the cockpit of the aircraft. One could hear the engine sputtering. Just about impossible to fly. George was once again yelling at his crew, asking them to hold on, and that he was going to get them as quickly as possible out of there. While he was struggling to bring the nose of the big bomber that was burning up, he jerked back on the control stick with great force. In an effort to get away from the island and into the open water, he started to direct the plane in a different direction. Within a short amount of time, he was able to steer the aircraft in the desired direction and escape the terrifying situation that was Chichijima. He was able to sense the plane's demise. However, there was a rapid decline in their altitude. His prior experience of being shot down came into play at this point in the sequence of events. He recalled with a high degree of clarity what had occurred the previous time and what the experienced pilots had shared with him. In the event that you are forced to make an emergency landing, the most essential rule is to fly as far away from the adversary as you possibly can. If you jump too early, you will end up in the ocean right near to their coastlines without any protection. Within minutes, their patrol boats will be on their way to you, and you will be taken into custody. For many people, being captured was a fate that was even more terrible than death. Since this was the case, George was resolute in his goal to create as much space as possible between his crew and that island. Holding on to the controls, he struggled to maintain the plane in the air for as long as he could, despite the fact that it was in the process of deteriorating. As he continued to fly, he descended more and farther, the waves of the Pacific Ocean drawing nearer and nearer to him. The area inside the airplane was a complete and utter mess. It was becoming more widespread. While he was standing behind him, Del and Ted were shouting at him, telling him that they needed to leap right away. They were able to see additional American planes that had been destroyed as a result of the raid far behind them. The crews of those planes were already evacuating, and their parachutes were flowering in the sky. Yet, George put up a fight. His voice yelled out, "No, hold on!" He continued to travel further and further out into the ocean. He pushed the plane to its ultimate limit till they were so close to the water that it was almost too late to jump at all. He then jumped out of the plane altogether. Not until that point, when he was aware that he was unable to achieve even a single foot of distance, did he issue the command. Jump! George released his grip on the management. He jumped out of the open door of the burning plane and bolted out of his pilot's seat just as the plane was on fire. It was the slipstream that got him as he jumped, and it hurled him against the tail of the airplane. On the back of the airplane, he had a severe blow to the head. He was stunned by the hit, but his training allowed him to recover. The ripcord was pulled by him. It was just a few moments before he struck the sea that his parachute opened, and the unexpected pull of the harness was what ultimately saved his life. So he dove headfirst into the water. We were taken aback by the icy water. As soon as he came to the surface, he found himself entangled in the lines of his parachute, with the heavy silk canopy threatening to pull him through. In a desperate attempt to get some air, he struggled and eventually succeeded in removing the strap from his shoulders. After pushing the parachute aside, he finally found the time to take a big breath. While he was treading water, he looked about. His jet, the one he had just jumped from, was now utterly empty and out of control, and he saw it for the first time. A few more moments passed before it smashed directly into the lake and vanished beneath the waves. It continued on for a few more moments. It was his crew that he initially thought about. He searched the sky and the water in an attempt to locate Del and Ted as desperately as he could. He was looking for their parachutes, as well as any other indication that they were present. However, he did not observe anything. Not a single other parachutist could be seen anywhere in the vicinity. His stomach dropped. Suddenly, he became aware of an astounding occurrence. It was a miracle that the life raft that was intended to deploy automatically from his plane had somehow landed in the ocean barely 10 feet away from him. Without a doubt, that was a stroke of absolute luck. He swam straight to the inflatable raft and pushed himself inside, his body aching and fatigued from the effects of the swim. He immediately returned his attention to his guys as soon as he entered the room. He began calling their names, his voice becoming hoarse as he did so. He yelled their names over and over again, "Ted!" Del, but did not receive any response. The only thing that could be heard was the sound of the wind and the waves. They did not appear to be present. He twisted around on the raft, and his gaze drifted back towards the island of Chichijima, which was now a faint shape on the horizon. He was looking at the island. He then became aware of it. This was the realization of his darkest nightmare. It was possible for him to observe a number of tiny boats moving quickly away from the island. The vessels were Japanese patrol boats, and they were moving at a high rate of speed in the direction of his location. He was well aware that they were seeking him and any other American airmen who had been shot down. His body experienced a wave of adrenaline. No one was going to be able to take him in. After making a complete turnaround, he positioned himself so that he was lying on his chest at the front of the raft and began paddling with his hands. As he attempted to get away from the boats that were approaching, he sank his hands into the water and pulled with every ounce of power he had left. Throughout the entire ordeal, he continually yelled out for Ted and Del, hoping against hope that he would eventually locate them. Nevertheless, he was unaware of the awful reality. Both of his crewmen had perished in the incident. They had not been able to get out of the plane at all, and as a result, they had perished along with the plane. Despite the fact that the second individual had jumped, his parachute did not open. Only George was present. The muscles in his body were burning as he paddled as hard as he could. After a while, he continued to stare behind him. As the boats approached, they got closer. He was aware that he could not outrun them. There was no way out of the predicament. At a certain point, the tiredness could no longer be tolerated. It dawned on him that he would not be able to locate his companions, nor would he be able to flee the situation. He simply sat up in the raft and stopped paddling at that moment. He turned around and shifted his attention to the police boats as they got closer to the area. He was aware that they would arrive at his location within a few minutes. He was about to be taken captive. His thoughts began to move at a breakneck pace. When it came to Ted and Del, he was overcome with feelings of remorse. He started to have second thoughts about his choice to keep the jet in the air for such a long time and to force them to make their escape so late. He pondered the possibility that I had been responsible for their deaths. He pondered his wife back at home and pondered whether or not he would ever have the opportunity to see her again. He shifted his attention back to the Japanese boats, which were now considerably closer to him, and started mentally preparing himself for a life of imprisonment or even worse possible circumstances. But at the same moment when he was about to give up all hope, he heard the noise of motors coming from above. When he looked up, he saw a formation of American planes soaring through the aerial space above him. Due to the fact that this was a fighter escort, they were not members of his initial raid group. As they swooped by him, they submerged themselves in the water and headed straight for the Japanese boats. They began firing their machine guns as the patrol boats were being strafed by the fire. They detonated bombs that caused enormous water plumes to be released into the atmosphere. When the quick and severe onslaught from the air occurred, the Japanese boats were totally concentrated with surviving it. This caused them to be thrown into pandemonium. George was unable to believe his good fortune. He was given the opportunity. Trying to escape the conflict that was taking place behind him, he turned around, got back on his chest, and began paddling once more. He paddled as quickly and as forcefully as he could, hoping to get away from the situation. Paddling for the next 2 hours was George's activity. He put as much distance as he could between himself and Chichijima by using every last bit of his power and every ounce of his determination to live. He did this in order to maximize his chances of survival. But in the end, his body was unable to continue. It was impossible for him to raise his arms and paddle one more time because he was so utterly and completely fatigued. After collapsing onto the raft, he was left hanging aimlessly in the huge ocean that was devoid of any life. While he was lying there for some time, he became aware of a peculiar sound, which he described as a mild whirring noise coming from beneath the water. With his head raised, he surveyed his surroundings. He then became aware of it. In close proximity to his raft, the periscope of a submarine was seen breaking the surface of the sea for the first time. It turned out to be an American submarine. Just a few seconds later, the submarine itself surfaced right next to him. Following the opening of the hatch, the crew emerged onto the deck. After grabbing him from the raft, they brought him onto the submarine and placed him inside the vessel in a secure manner. He was spared from death. In addition to George, Ted, and Dell, there were 8 more American servicemen who were forced to escape their damaged aircraft with the assistance of a rescue helicopter during the same operation. For a considerable amount of time, the official narrative stated that these 8 individuals were never found again. As a result of the fact that they were reported missing in action, the general consensus was that they had simply perished while at sea. However, that was not the real event that took place. The government of the United States of America was able to determine the facts in a relatively short amount of time. Nevertheless, the specifics were so terrible and so absolutely horrific that they made a decision. They came to the conclusion that they would not reveal the truth to anyone. They were especially adamant about not informing the members of these 8 airmen's families, including their wives and parents. The administration was of the opinion that the families would be unable to tolerate the severity of the situation if they were to confront the truth. All of the information regarding what transpired with those 8 men was therefore seen to be of the utmost importance. The truth was concealed there. For a period of 60 years, the secret was retained. The families of those guys went to their graves with the mistaken belief that their sons had been lost at sea. In 2004, however, a writer by the name of James Bradley began conducting research for a book. During the course of his investigation, he came upon a collection of documents that had reached the declassification stage. The transcripts were from a Japanese war crimes trial that had been held on the island of Guam after World War II. The trial had been held in the aftermath of the war. According to these transcripts, Japanese military officers who were caught admitted in their own words to the specific actions that they had taken against the 8 American airmen who were taken captive. Eventually, the truth of the matter was going to be revealed. These 8 other airmen had bailed out practically quickly after their planes were hit over the ocean, in contrast to George, who had flown his jet as far away from the island as he could possibly get it. This indicated that they landed in the ocean in close proximity to the coast of Chichijima. Therefore, before any American rescue planes could rush in and save the day like they did for George, Japanese patrol boats had hurried out and scooped all 8 of them out of the water. This was done before any American rescue planes could come in. Having been taken as prisoners of war, they were brought back to the island. Their circumstances were really precarious. Over the course of several months, the Japanese forces stationed on Chichijima had been subjected to a continuous bombardment. They had witnessed the deaths of their colleagues and fellow service members at the hands of the very American aircraft that these airmen had been flying. It was clear that they harbored a profound and raging hatred for the Americans, and they desired to exact their vengeance. In addition, all of a sudden, they found themselves in possession of 8 American hostages on their island, entirely at their mercy and with no one to protect them. Immediately after that, there was a complete and utter plunge into barbarism. After being taken into custody, the 8 individuals were gathered together in a temporary prison area within 24 hours of their capture. A Japanese commander entered the area and pointed his finger at one of the individuals who were present. He went by the name of Marv Marchant. His hometown was Long Beach, California, and he was of the age of 19. Marv was abducted by the soldiers, who then hauled him away from the group and brought him to a central location within their military establishment. At that location, they bound him to a tree. After that, the commander urged all of the other soldiers stationed at the base to vent their frustrations on the defenseless prisoner. Over the course of the entire day, a constant stream of Japanese soldiers approached Marv and repeatedly beat him. They hit him with whatever they could find, including punching him, kicking him, and generally hitting him. Marv was unable to stand up for himself because he was bound to the tree and unable to move. In addition, the 7 other American detainees were compelled to watch the entire event without having the ability to break the chain of command. On that particular evening, the same commander returned. Untying Marv, who was severely injured and barely awake, from the tree, he freed him. He instructed the remaining 7 captives to remain in their current location. Marv was then led away from the party and into the dark jungle by the commander, who was accompanied by several other Japanese soldiers. They took him by foot to a location where a burial had already been dug when he arrived. An individual who was a Japanese soldier and was clutching a long sword was seen standing near to this recently dug tomb. The instruction given to Marv was to stroll to the edge of the pit. They forced him to get down on his knees in front of it. A cigarette was presented to him as a parting gift, as a final gesture. The testimony indicates that Marv smoked the cigarette in a well-composed manner. After he had completed his task, the individual who was holding the blade covered his eyes with a blindfold. Following that, he instructed Marv to forward extend his neck. After Marv had finished speaking, the soldier raised the blade and proceeded to behead him. After that, they buried him by transporting his body to the grave and burying it there. In spite of this, the horror was not yet ended. Yoshio Tachibana, a Japanese general who held one of the highest ranks on the island, was one of the individuals who was there in his quarters on that particular night. There was little doubt that Tachibana was an alcoholic, and he was notorious for his nasty and sadistic inclinations, particularly toward those who were incarcerated. As he was lounging around and drinking with his officers, he had an idea that was so heinous that it was beyond comprehension. According to his perverted thinking, there was only one way for his soldiers to genuinely demonstrate that they possessed what he referred to as the fighting spirit. He announced that his soldiers needed to demonstrate that they possessed this fighting spirit by ingesting human flesh. This resulted in Tachibana issuing a horrifying command. His soldiers were instructed to return to the jungle, locate the shallow grave, and exhume the body of Marv Marchant. He gave them this instruction. Then, Tachibana dispatched one of his surgeons to the scene. Therefore, he gave the surgeon the order to remove Marv's thigh. Surgically removing the thigh muscle, the surgeon went to the body and performed the procedure. Afterwards, he handed it over to one of the cooks. In order to provide the general and his high-ranking officers with a substantial lunch, the cooks utilized the meat that was taken from Marv's thigh. As well as Tachibana and the others, they were served it. As stated in the admissions that were presented during the trial, they consumed it with soy sauce and accompanied it with sake. In addition, it appears that they took pleasure in it to such an extent that Tachibana gave orders to his soldiers to return to Marv's body and remove further meat, which they did. The act of cannibalism that was committed was not a one-time heinous murder. Some of the other officers, including Tachibana, held the belief that it was a superstition. They were under the impression that consuming the flesh of their adversaries would not only make them more powerful, but would also be beneficial to their digestive systems and their overall health. Approximately 1 month after Marv's execution and consumption, Tachibana made the decision that he desired more. More human flesh was something he wanted his warriors to consume. On account of this, they came to the conclusion that they would not only kill more of the American prisoners, but also consume them. 7 of the surviving American detainees were carried out to the island's rifle range for their final examination. When all 7 of the prisoners were arranged in a line, one of the Japanese officers approached and grabbed Floyd Hall, a 25-year-old man from Missouri. They separated him from the rest of the party, led him to the center of the shooting range, and then bound him to a stake made of wood that had been driven the entire way into the ground. The order was given by General Tachibana, who was present to keep an eye on the situation once Floyd had been secured. It was his instruction to the other Japanese soldiers that they should practice their bayonet on Floyd Hall. Before Floyd ultimately succumbed to his wounds, the soldiers approached him one by one and repeatedly stabbed their bayonets into his chest and stomach. This continued until Floyd was unable to recover from his injuries. It was specifically for this reason that Tachibana had taken his surgeons along with him. It was immediately after Floyd had passed away that he dispatched the surgeons to the field. The 6 surviving convicts were terrified as they watched the surgeons cut up Floyd's body and extract his liver and gallbladder. The physicians did this in full view of the prisoners. In order to ensure the organ's preservation, they were wrapped in cellophane paper. Due to the fact that they were aware that this was not the final execution of the day, the surgeons made their way back to the edge of the field and placed themselves there. The remaining 6 prisoners looked around in a state of terror, wondering who would be the next person to be taken. Another one of the captives was reached by a commander who walked over and grabbed them. He went under the name of Earl Vaughn. Born in Texas, he was 22 years old at the time. Immediately after the troops grabbed him, Earl was aware of what was going to happen. After seeing what they had done to Floyd, he came to the conclusion that he did not want to experience the same thing. He consequently grew defiant. It was his desire to pass away, but he desired to pass away more rapidly. As he approached the Japanese soldiers, he began yelling "Semper Fi," which is the motto of the United States Marine Corps. By repeatedly extending his neck and pointing to it, he was conveying the message that he desired a swift and uncomplicated execution. It was his desire for them to behead him. The Japanese attempted to secure him to the wooden post with the intention of allowing the other soldiers to engage in additional bayonet training with him. However, Earl put up such a strong fight that it was impossible to overcome. The man continued to struggle and put his neck out, demanding that he be severed from his head. One of the soldiers eventually gave up, pulled him down to his knees, and then proceeded to behead him as a means of putting an end to his life. and once more, the surgeons rushed out onto the field to perform their examinations. They removed Earl's liver and gallbladder and wrapped them in cellophane paper while they were in plain view of the 5 American captives who were still being held. The cooks prepared the organs of both Floyd and Earl that night, and all of the high-ranking Japanese officers who were stationed on the island feasted on them when they were ready. Within a short period of time, the remaining 5 captives were also put to death in a manner that was comparable to the brutality of the executions, usually in front of their fellow soldiers. Additionally, 2 of the remaining 5 were consumed by the Japanese officers and were consumed by them. On the other hand, the Japanese devised a fate that was even more monstrous for one of those 2 remaining men. Prior to his execution, they did not carry it out. Rather than that, they kept him alive while surgeons amputated various parts of his body through surgical procedures. They would first cut off a limb, then transfer it to a place where it would be cooked and consumed, and once they had finished, they would return for more. The reason they did this was to ensure that their meat remained as fresh as possible. They proceeded to cut off more and more pieces of him until there was an insufficient amount of flesh left for consumption. At that precise moment, the imprisoned individual was finally put to death. In the aftermath of the war's conclusion, the Allied forces initiated the process of prosecuting those who had committed war crimes. For the war crimes that they committed against these 8 American prisoners of war, 34 Japanese soldiers from Chichijima, including General Yoshio Tachibana, were brought before the court for trial. They were all found to be responsible. Following their execution by hanging, their bodies were laid to rest in unmarked graves on the island of Guam. All of them had been sentenced to death. In addition, other men on the island who had witnessed the atrocities but had done nothing to stop them, or who had participated in a secondary role, were also tried for war crimes. Despite the fact that they were all sentenced to prison and found guilty, they were all released after serving only 8 years in prison. What about George, the young pilot who was saved by the submarine? What happened to him? He had reached the age of 80 when he was finally able to acquire the complete truth regarding the atrocities that took place on Chichijima Island, the fate that he had narrowly avoided. Following the publication of James Bradley's book, the narrative was made available to the general public. When George heard it, he felt the same horrified and deeply disturbed feelings that everyone else did. In addition to everything else, however, he experienced a profound and enduring sense of guilt. He experienced the feelings of survivor's guilt because he was the only one who had survived the ordeal, while a large number of other people had to endure such an unimaginable end. Nevertheless, one thing that we can all agree on is that George did not squander the second chance he was given in life. The pilot, George H. W. Bush, who was only 20 years old at the time, would go on to become the 41st President of the United States of America eventually. Furthermore, his son, who was also named George Bush, would go on to become the 43rd President of the United States of America. If George Sr. had jumped out of that burning plane near Chichijima Island just a few seconds earlier, 2 world leaders who would change the course of history forever would never have existed. These 2 leaders would have changed the course of history forever. Give that some thought. You are very much appreciated for watching. If you saw today's program, please share your thoughts with me in the comments section. You should also keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime ready for you to watch in one sitting right now. Up until the next time. What's up? On the morning of Monday, the 7th of January, 1985, a 31-year-old man walked through the sliding glass doors of a large international airport. He was trying his best to look calm, to look like just another traveler, but on the inside, a storm was raging. His heart was hammering against his ribs so hard he was sure the people around him could hear it. His palms were slick with sweat, making it difficult to keep a firm grip on the handles of the heavy, tangent-colored suitcase he was pulling alongside him. Every few steps, he had to stop, wipe his hands on his pants, and readjust his grip. He was nervous because he was at a crossroads, about to do something that felt both absolutely right and horribly wrong at the same time. On one hand, this trip was the culmination of months of dreaming, of planning. It was meant to be the first day of a brand new, wonderful life. A life he had envisioned down to the smallest detail. He hadn't packed much for himself, just a few changes of clothes, some toiletries, but he did have one very important personal item tucked away in his carry-on bag. It was a small, bound book filled with photographs, pictures that showed the single most important thing in his world. And that most important thing, that person, was supposed to be waiting for him in America, but on the other hand, a wave of pure terror kept washing over him. Before he could even begin to think about that new life, he had to get through this airport. He had a monumental problem to solve, and that problem was sitting right inside of the very heavy suitcase he was struggling with. He needed to get that suitcase onto his flight, a nearly 11-hour journey to California, without a single person looking inside of it. If anyone opened it, his life wasn't just starting over, it was over. And so, standing there in the bustling terminal, surrounded by the sounds of rolling luggage and announcements over the intercom, the man took a deep, shaky breath. He tightened his grip on the suitcase, handles one more time, and started walking towards the ticketing area. His plan was simple, at least on paper. He would walk up to the counter, hand over his passport and ticket, and check his bag. Then he would get on the plane. And when he landed in California, he would walk to the baggage carousel, retrieve his luggage, and everything would be okay. The nightmare would be over, and the dream could begin. Of course, he knew this was an incredible gamble. A huge risk. If there had been any other way, he would have taken it. His first choice would have been to just carry the bag onto the plane with him, to stow it in the overhead bin where he could keep an eye on it. But that was impossible. The bag was far too big, and it was unbelievably heavy. Anyone who tried to lift it would know something was wrong. So, checking it was his only option. The only other choice was to leave it behind, and that was unthinkable. He cared too much about what was inside to ever consider that. As he got closer to the airline check-in area, the line of people snaked in front of him. With every person that moved forward, his own turn got closer, and the knot of anxiety in his stomach tightened. He was starting to feel physically ill, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. He thought about turning around, about just walking out of the airport and giving up, but he couldn't. He had to see this through. By the time he finally reached the front of the line, he felt dizzy, but he forced himself to stand straight. He walked up to the counter for Lufthansa Airlines, trying to arrange his face into a pleasant, neutral expression. The employee behind the counter, a cheerful-looking man, greeted him with a smile. He took the man's passport, glanced at it, typed some information into his computer, and then handed it back. Then came the moment the man had been dreading. The employee put his hand out, gesturing towards the heavy tan suitcase. This was it. This was the moment it could all fall apart. Trying to appear as casual as he could, the man lifted the suitcase off the floor and onto the scale next to the counter. For a split second, he panicked. The sheer effort it took, the way his muscles strained, it had to be obvious. He was sure the employee would look at the weight on the scale, look at him, and immediately demand he open the bag. If that happened, he knew he was finished. He would be arrested on the spot. But the employee didn't seem to notice. Or if he did, he didn't care. He just grunted a little as he slid the heavy suitcase off the scale and over to the conveyor belt behind the counter. The nervous man watched, his eyes glued to the bag as the employee heaved it onto the moving belt. He kept his gaze locked on that suitcase as it rolled away from him, getting smaller and smaller until it finally disappeared through a pair of black rubber flaps at the far end of the belt. He was so focused on the bag, so lost in that moment of intense relief, that he almost didn't hear the airline employee trying to get his attention. The employee was holding his boarding pass, waving it slightly in the air. The man snapped out of his trance, took the boarding pass, and managed to mumble a thank you. Then he turned, without a second glance back, and hurried away to find his gate and catch his flight. About 12 hours later, on the other side of the world, an employee for that same airline, Lufthansa, was making his rounds in the baggage claim area at Los Angeles International Airport, better known as LAX. It was around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Los Angeles time. The employee's job was pretty straightforward. He worked in the international terminal, and he had to monitor the big circular carousels where passengers from arriving flights picked up their luggage. He was there to make sure no bags were left behind. As he walked his usual route, his eyes scanned the carousels. Most were empty, waiting for the next flight to come in. But on one of them, he saw a single piece of luggage, a tangent-colored suitcase with soft sides just sitting there all by itself. The carousel had stopped moving. He stopped and looked up at the monitor above it to check which flight it had been for. The screen showed that the last plane to use this carousel had arrived quite a while ago. All the passengers had clearly come through, grabbed their bags, and gone on their way. All except for the owner of this one lone suitcase. The employee figured the bag must be unclaimed. This wasn't a big deal to him. It happened all the time for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes bags got sent to the wrong airport by mistake. Sometimes a passenger missed a connecting flight. Sometimes people were just forgetful and walked right out of the airport without their luggage. Whatever the reason, his job was to start the process of identifying the owner and getting the bag to them. So, like he had done countless times before, he walked over to the carousel. He reached down, grabbed the suitcase by its handle, and prepared to lift it off. But as he pulled up, a surprised grunt escaped his lips, and he stumbled backward a step. The suitcase was so much heavier than he could have possibly imagined. It felt like it was filled with rocks. He readjusted his grip, this time using both hands, bent his knees, and gave it a solid yank. The suitcase toppled off the carousel and landed on the floor with a heavy thud. It was around this time that the employee noticed something else that was strange. The suitcase had no tags on it at all. No airline tag with a destination, no personal luggage tag with a name and address. Nothing. Now, this was unusual. An unclaimed bag was one thing, but an unclaimed bag that was incredibly heavy and had no identification whatsoever, that was not normal. He knelt down on the floor next to the suitcase. He was legally allowed to open it. Unclaimed bags at airports are subject to search to identify the owner or check the contents. He found the zipper and began to pull it open. But he had only unzipped it a few inches before he froze. His eyes went wide. For a second, he just stared, unblinking, at what he could see inside the suitcase, unable to process it. Then, a jolt of adrenaline shot through him. He scrambled to his feet, leaving the bag half open on the floor, and ran to find the nearest phone to call the police. A little less than 2 hours later, at about 3:45 in the afternoon, Detective Don Ravens of the Los Angeles Police Department's Pacific Division stood in that same baggage area at LAX. He was looking down grimly into the open tan suitcase. He was surrounded by other officials from the LAPD as well as agents from the FBI. They had all been called to the airport because of what that Lufthansa employee had found. Inside the suitcase was the dead body of a young woman. Detective Ravens was taken aback. He'd seen a lot in his career, but this was something else. He guessed the woman was young, probably not even 30 years old. Looking at her features, her dark hair, he thought she might be from an Asian or a Latin American country, but that was just a guess. It was as far as he could get, since she had no identification on her and there were no tags on the bag. There were also no obvious wounds on her body, no signs of a stabbing or a gunshot. He couldn't immediately tell how she had died. Ravens spent the next hour or so speaking to airline and airport employees. He also spoke with agents from Customs, the government agency in charge of inspecting bags coming into the country. One of the biggest questions on his mind was how a suitcase with a body inside it had managed to clear customs without being detected. But a customs agent explained that they didn't actually open every single suitcase that came through. They used X-ray machines and sometimes dogs, but physical searches were random or based on suspicion. This meant that whoever had checked this bag had taken a colossal risk. At any point, the bag could have been flagged for a search, and the body would have been discovered instantly. This suggested a level of desperation, maybe even recklessness, on the part of the person who did this, but it seemed their risk had paid off, at least initially. The bag had made it all the way to California. Despite that, Ravens didn't have much to go on. His victim was a Jane Doe, with no name and no past. He knew she could be from anywhere in the world, despite his initial hunch. And because LAX was a major international hub, the person who put her in that suitcase could now also be anywhere in the world. They could have gotten on another flight and disappeared. Once Detective Ravens and the other investigators finished their preliminary examination of the scene, they didn't remove the body from the suitcase. They had the entire suitcase, with the body still inside, carefully transported to the coroner's office. Ravens hoped that an autopsy would turn up some kind of evidence, anything that could tell them who this poor woman was and what had happened to her. The next day, Tuesday, Ravens sat at his desk and opened the manila folder that had been delivered from the coroner's office. Inside was the autopsy report for his Jane Doe. As he began to read it, a sick feeling washed over him. The cold, clinical language of the report described a horrible, torturous death. The coroner had found bruises all over the woman's body. The report specified that they were the kind of deep contusions you would get from repeated, heavy blows delivered over a period of at least several hours while she was still alive. It looked like she had been brutally beaten, and her eventual cause of death was listed as suffocation. This meant one of two things. Either she was suffocated first and then put into the suitcase, or she had been put in the suitcase alive and had suffocated inside of it, trapped. Ravens put the report down and leaned back in his chair, trying to process what he had just learned. The autopsy confirmed that this young woman had died a brutal, awful death. But it hadn't brought him any closer to finding her identity. The coroner had found no identifying marks, no surgical scars, no tattoos, nothing that could help give her a name. And they found nothing on her that pointed to who might have done this to her. So, he was left with very little. He knew a woman had suffered terribly, but that was it. In the 24 hours since the body was found, Ravens had been working tirelessly. He and his team had pored over hours and hours of surveillance footage from the airport's security cameras. They were looking for anyone who looked suspicious, anyone who might have been seen in the baggage claim area and then left without any luggage. But nothing jumped out at them. He had also personally interviewed a number of airport employees who were working in the international terminal on the day the body was found. But none of them had noticed anything strange, anything out of the ordinary. And so, even though it had only been a day since the discovery, Ravens was already starting to worry that this case was going to go cold very quickly. But what Ravens hadn't counted on was the massive amount of public interest his Jane Doe case would generate. As soon as the story broke, the local TV news stations and the newspapers were all over it. The body in the suitcase story was shocking, and it captured the public's imagination. By Wednesday, just 48 hours after the body was found, the reporting had spread far beyond Los Angeles. The story made its way to Peru, where a man named Juan Espinosa saw a news report and immediately contacted the local authorities. He told them he believed the body found in Los Angeles might belong to his wife. The officials in Peru contacted the LAPD, and Juan's report eventually landed on Detective Ravens' desk. Ravens opened the file and began to read. According to Juan, he and his wife lived in Lima, the capital of Peru. His wife had been desperate to leave the country to escape the crushing poverty they faced. Her dream was to get to the United States, find a job, and send money back home to her family. She had left their home with the intention of trying to sneak across the border into the U.S. She had promised Juan that as soon as she arrived safely, she would contact him. But after she left, he never heard a single word from her. This felt like a very promising lead to Ravens. It seemed to check a lot of the boxes. His Jane Doe had features that could suggest she was from a South American country like Peru. It made sense. Ravens started to build a theory. Maybe Juan's wife had paid a human smuggler, someone who transports immigrants across borders illegally for a fee. He knew that the world of human smuggling was a dangerous, unregulated business. The smugglers could be violent and reckless, and the people they were transporting were incredibly vulnerable. They had no legal protection. Sometimes, these smugglers would simply rob their clients. In worse cases, they would rob them and then kill them to get rid of any witnesses. And because the victims were undocumented and their families often didn't know the details of their travel plans, these terrible crimes often went unreported and unnoticed. If that's what had happened to his Jane Doe, it would explain a lot. It would explain the signs of a brutal beating from the autopsy. It would also explain why the tags were ripped off the suitcase. A smuggler who had just committed a murder would want to remove any form of identification from the body or the luggage that could possibly be traced back to them. Feeling a renewed sense of purpose, Ravens picked up his phone and called the LAX airport operations manager. He asked for the logs of any and all flights that had come from Peru to LAX on the day the body was found. But when he got the information back, he discovered a huge problem with his theory. There were no flights from Peru that day. Not a single one. He checked again. The only international flights that had used the specific luggage carousel where the body was found were from 3 cities: Seoul, Korea, Tokyo, Japan, and Frankfurt, Germany. He even checked to see if there were any flights that had originated in Peru and had a layover in one of those 3 countries. There were none. This meant it was simply impossible that his Jane Doe was Juan's wife. And just like that, his most promising lead evaporated. Now Ravens was stumped all over again. He had almost no physical evidence to work with. All he really had was the suitcase itself and the body inside it. And the actual crime scene, the place where this woman was killed, was most likely in Korea, Japan, or Germany. He was an LAPD detective. His jurisdiction was Los Angeles. He didn't know where he should even begin to look for more evidence. He felt like he was back at square one. But then, as he sat at his desk staring at the case file, he got an idea. Detective Ravens stood up and walked down the hall to the department's evidence room. He put on a pair of disposable latex gloves. He found the cardboard box that contained the evidence from the Jane Doe case and opened it up. There wasn't much inside. Just a few sealed plastic bags containing the jewelry and the clothing that had been found on the woman's body. All of it had already been examined by the forensics team for trace evidence like blood, hair, or fibers. But Ravens wasn't looking for blood or hair. One by one, he carefully lifted out each of the sealed bags. He looked at a small ring, a simple necklace. Then he got to her clothes. He pulled out the bag containing a blue sweater. He took the sweater out of the plastic and turned it over in his hands. He looked inside the neckband at the small white tag sewn into the fabric. And there he found exactly what he had been hoping for. A jolt of adrenaline shot through him. He felt he was onto something. He quickly reached back into the box and grabbed another plastic bag, this one with a pair of gray pants inside. He did the same thing, looking at the tag on the waistband. Then he opened a third bag with her blouse and checked the label inside that. Each time, his hunch was proven right. All of Jane Doe's clothing had labels sewn into them, and the writing on the labels was clearly in a language that was not English. Ravens wasn't a linguistics expert, but to him, the script, the shape of the letters, looked like it might be Middle Eastern. It didn't take long for the FBI to help Ravens and the LAPD identify the origin of the writing on the clothing. The labels were in Farsi. All of the clothes had been made in the Middle East, specifically in Iran. This was a huge breakthrough. Finally, Detective Ravens had a likely country of origin for his Jane Doe. She was almost certainly Iranian. But with this new information came another problem. It was really the same problem he'd had when he thought the victim was from Peru. There were only 3 international flights that his Jane Doe could have been on, the ones from Korea, Japan, and Germany. None of them had originated in Iran. And he double-checked the records. There were no connecting flights from Iran to any of those 3 cities that would have lined up with the arrival time at LAX that day. Ravens felt like he was going in circles. He decided he needed the public's help again. On Thursday, 3 days after the body was found, he and another detective sat down for an interview with a reporter from the city's biggest newspaper, the Los Angeles Times, a publication that had a wide circulation both nationally and internationally. The detective's goal was simple: to give the reporter as many updates as they could about the case, hoping that someone, somewhere in the world, would read the story, recognize a detail, and come forward with information. However, the interview didn't really play out that way. The reporter asked a lot of questions, and for most of them, Ravens and his partner had no answers. By the end of it, Ravens was feeling pretty discouraged. The last thing he said to the reporter, a quote that ended up being printed as the final line of the article, summed up his frustration perfectly. He said, "Don't be too surprised if you never find out where she came from or who she is." The next morning, Detective Ravens got to his office early. He had barely taken off his coat when his desk phone rang. He picked it up. A police officer from Sacramento, California, was on the other end of the line, and he sounded extremely worked up. He told Ravens that he knew the LAPD investigators were struggling with the airport Jane Doe case, but he said he had an unbelievable development up in Northern California that he was certain was connected. He told Ravens that authorities there had just found another body. When Ravens heard this, his first reaction wasn't excitement. It was confusion. He didn't need another body. He had a body. What he needed was a name for his Jane Doe. So he asked the Sacramento officer what he meant. Had they found another woman in another suitcase? But the officer said no. The body they found belonged to a man. And this man's name had never been on any police radar. He had died from a gunshot wound 400 miles away from where Raven's Jane Doe was found. But, the officer insisted, the story they had uncovered behind this new body would almost certainly solve the Jane Doe case in Los Angeles. This is the story that the Sacramento officer told Detective Ravens over the phone. On the evening of Monday, January 7th, just a few hours after Jane Doe's body had been discovered at LAX, a man named Hadi had driven to the Sacramento airport. He was there to pick up his friend and roommate, a 31-year-old man named Mahmoud Ayazi. Hadi was excited to see Mahmoud, who had been away on a trip for a few weeks. They were good friends, and Hadi always enjoyed being around Mahmoud. He was normally a very optimistic, fun-loving person. But on this day, when Mahmoud got into Hadi's car, Hadi immediately knew something was wrong. His friend seemed withdrawn and quiet. He was clearly very upset about something. Hadi asked him what was wrong, if his trip had gone okay. But Mahmoud just shook his head and said he was just sick with the flu. But to Hadi, Mahmoud didn't look sick. He looked worried. He looked jittery and nervous. And as they started to drive away from the airport, Mahmoud kept looking out the windows, checking the rearview mirror, like he was afraid that someone was following them. When they got back to their apartment, Mahmoud went straight to his room and went to bed. And for the next 2 days, his behavior only got stranger and more paranoid. He asked Hadi to disconnect the phone in their apartment. He said he didn't want to see any of their mutual friends. He spent most of his time just looking out the windows of their apartment as if he was watching for someone. But whenever Hadi tried to ask him what was going on, what he was so worried about, Mahmoud refused to explain. Then, sometime before 6 o'clock on Thursday morning, 3 days after Hadi had picked him up from the airport, Hadi was woken up by a sound. He heard the front door of their apartment open and then click shut. It was way too early for either of them to be up and about. And they lived in a part of the city where break-ins weren't uncommon. So the sound of the door was enough to make Hadi get out of bed and go check things out. But when he got to the living room, he didn't find an intruder. He found Mahmoud, fully dressed, in the process of leaving the apartment. Hadi asked his friend where he was going so early. But Mahmoud just shook his head and said he was just going out for a bit. There was nothing Hadi could do to stop him, so he just watched his friend walk out the door. And then Hadi went back to bed. But as he lay there, he had this sick feeling in his stomach, a feeling that something terrible was about to happen. About 2 hours later, the Sacramento Police Department received a call. Someone had found a dead body in the driver's seat of a car in a nearby parking lot. When officers arrived, they found the body of a man who had clearly died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. And on the passenger seat next to the body, they found 2 Iranian passports and 1 boarding pass for a Lufthansa Airlines flight. Instead of everyone. When the Sacramento police officer finished telling Detective Ravens this story, he said that he believed one of the 2 passports they found in that car belonged to Ravens' Jane Doe. He said he would send it down to Los Angeles that afternoon by courier so Ravens could make a positive identification. And when the passport arrived, Ravens opened the package with trembling hands. He looked at the photograph inside. And there she was. He was finally able to give his Jane Doe her name back. She was a 20-year-old Iranian woman named Katan Safawi. And after investigators searched Mahmoud Ayazi's apartment in Sacramento, they would find one more piece of evidence that would finally explain the whole tragic story of how Katan Safawi had ended up dead inside an abandoned tan suitcase at LAX. That piece of evidence was a small, bound book, and it was full of photographs. Back on the 7th of January, 1985, a deeply nervous Mahmoud Ayazi dropped off the tan suitcase at the international airport in Frankfurt, Germany. It was one of the 3 cities that had flights arriving at LAX that day that used the specific carousel where the body was found. Inside that suitcase was Katan. Mahmoud then boarded his Lufthansa flight to Los Angeles. His trip hadn't started in Frankfurt, though. It had started weeks earlier in his home country of Iran. He had traveled there for the happiest of reasons. His travel plans had gotten complicated on the way back, and he'd gotten stuck in Germany for several days, which only added to his stress. And now, he was on the final leg of his journey home, and he was more nervous than he had ever been in his life because of what he was carrying in his checked luggage. He had thought that once he successfully checked the suitcase and got on the plane, he would feel some relief. But as his flight took off from Frankfurt, his anxiety only grew worse. The flight was nearly 11 hours long. And for every single one of those hours, he sat in his seat, his mind racing. Every time the plane hit even the slightest bit of turbulence, he imagined the worst. He pictured the suitcases in the cargo hold shifting and crashing into each other. He wanted to scream. But finally, after what felt like an eternity, the flight landed at LAX. As soon as the plane taxied to the gate, Mahmoud was on his feet. He got off the plane as fast as he could and practically ran to the baggage claim area. He needed to get his suitcase and then get on his connecting flight to Sacramento. He stood by the carousel, his heart pounding, waiting for that tan suitcase to appear. When it finally did, he snatched it off the belt. But as soon as he lifted it, he felt a cold dread wash over him. Something felt wrong. With a shaking hand, he moved to a more secluded corner of the baggage claim area, laid the suitcase down, and unzipped it. And when he looked inside, a wave of grief and horror so powerful hit him that he almost collapsed right there on the floor. The trip that Mahmoud had been dreaming of for months, the journey he was now returning from, was a trip to his home country of Iran to marry the woman he loved, Katan. And now, lying still and lifeless inside that suitcase, was the dead body of his new wife. Mahmoud had been trying to smuggle her into America so they could start their new life together. After their wedding in Iran, they had traveled to Frankfurt. But when they got there, Katan had run into problems with her visa. German officials would not let her board the plane to the United States. Mahmoud and Katan spent days trying to fix the problem, pleading with officials, but it became clear that only Mahmoud, who had the proper paperwork, would be allowed to enter the U.S. Katan would have to stay behind. They were devastated. And in their desperation, they came up with a reckless plan. Katan willingly got inside that suitcase. Mahmoud hadn't murdered her, at least not intentionally. She hadn't been trafficked or kidnapped. She chose to get in that suitcase. Together, they decided that he would smuggle her in the cargo hold of the plane. That's how they would get her to the United States and be together. When he had checked the bag in Frankfurt, she had been alive. But during the long flight, in the dark, unpressurized, and unheated cargo hold, other heavy pieces of luggage must have shifted and fallen, piling on top of her suitcase. The repeated impacts and the immense weight had slowly crushed her to death. The bruises the coroner found were not from a beating at the hands of a person, but from the brutal, indifferent force of other luggage crashing against her body inside that suitcase. And so when Mahmoud got to LAX and opened the suitcase and saw what had happened, he fell apart. He panicked. In a fog of shock and grief, he tore the identification and tags off the suitcase. He zipped it back up, pushed it back onto the carousel, and just walked away. He abandoned the body of his wife and simply got on his next flight to Sacramento. And once he landed there, the full weight of what had happened, the guilt and the grief, consumed him. For 3 days, he lived in a paranoid haze, unable to tell his friend what had happened, unable to face the reality of his loss and the role he had played in it. And 3 days later, he took his own life. When the police in Sacramento searched Mahmoud's room, they found the little bound book full of photographs that he had so carefully packed for his trip. The photos were of his and Katan's wedding. Pictures of 2 young people, smiling and full of hope, on what should have been the beginning of their new life together. The following week, the bodies of both Mahmoud and Katan were sent back to Iran. They traveled the same route they had taken to get to Los Angeles, a long journey from California through Germany and back to their home. But this time, they traveled together. Sometimes, the most ordinary decisions, like boarding a flight or chasing a dream, carry consequences no one could ever imagine. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, there's a whole playlist waiting for you. Until next time.